I've been asked to talk both about, I will refer to Ramana Maharshi as Bhagavan, which is how people generally refer to him. It's a more affectionate name. Um, uh, Bhagavan, I've been asked to talk not only about Bhagavan's teachings, but also about his life. So I'll start by giving a very brief outline of his life. Um, he was born at the end of 1879, and he had a seemingly ordinary childhood up to a certain point. Um, at the age of when he was 12 years old, his father passed away, and when he was taken to see his father's body before they cremated it, his father's body was laid on a table or bench or whatever, and everyone was weeping. And he looked at his father's body and he was puzzled because he was thinking, all this time, I've been taking this body to be my father, but now they say my father has gone. So what is it that, what is my father and what is it that has gone? So as he was thinking about this, he finally came to the conclusion, I now know the I in me, but my father's I has left his body. So it was at that time that he he already understood that there's this distinction between I and the body. Though now we mistake the body to be I, actually they're two distinct things. Um, about 4 years, um, that was when he was 12. When he was about 15, he read a book called Periya Puranam, which is a collection of stories of Tamil saints. And when he read that, he he felt very strong devotion, and without expressing it to anyone, he felt in his heart he would like to be like those 63 saints. He would like to have such devotion and complete surrender to God. Those were two outstanding things in his early life. But then in the summer of 1896, when he was 16 years old, in July, one day, he was sitting in an upstairs room. At that time, he was staying in an uncle's house in Madurai, and he was supposed to be studying for his schoolwork. So he was sitting in an upstairs room studying, when suddenly he was overwhelmed by an intense fear of death. His immediate response to this fear of death was, well, he described it later in words, but he said actually it wasn't a thought process. It was just something that happened spontaneously. But the way he described it, he said, but when this fear of death came to him, he wanted to know, with the death of this body, am I also going to die? So in order to find out whether I will die along with the body, he needed to find out who am I or what am I. So he turned his entire attention within, and this all happened within a split second. He turned his attention within to see what he actually was, and at that moment, he clearly experienced his real nature as infinite, pure awareness. And thereby the ego was completely eradicated. Ego means the false awareness, I am this body. That was completely eradicated. And from then on, he experienced himself only as that pure awareness. Even to say from then on is not quite correct. We say it from our perspective, but when ego is annihilated and we experience ourselves as pure awareness is eternal and unchanging. So he experienced himself as that eternal and unchanging pure awareness. And thus it wasn't like this was a new experience. This was the eternal experience. This is what he always was. In other words, the false ego had been annihilated and what was real remained as it always was. So his inward life from then on was completely, was just remaining as that pure awareness. But in our view, his body continued to live for another 54 years. A few months after that event, he left his home in Madurai and he traveled to Tiruvannamalai, which is a town at the foot of the holy hill Arunachala. He felt that call to come there, and he spent the remaining 54 years of his life there. Early, the early years of his stay there, he was very much inward turned. I mean, again, we're talking from our perspective. From his perspective, it's quite different. So he was very unmindful of the body, and he was for a few weeks he was living in the temple ground. There's a very big 25-acre temple in Tiruvannamalai. So he was living within the grounds of the temple, and then because school children of his age, seeing this young boy, seemingly meditating or whatever. He wasn't actually meditating, he was just absorbed in himself. They took it as an object of fun, and they were trying to tease him and throw stones and things. So he found an underground temple where he could be undisturbed. So he went and he sat in that temple, and it seems he was in that temple for several weeks, and nobody knew about it until one day some passers-by saw some boys throwing stones into that temple. So they chased the boys away, and out came a local sadhu called Seshadri Swami. So they thought the boys were throwing stones at Seshadri Swami. So they said, Swami, are you okay? He said, I'm okay, but go inside and see what is there. So they took a lantern and they went down inside. And there was a temple. It was a small shrine within the big temple complex. It had been neglected for many years. So the floor was covered with dirt and insects were falling over the floor and everything. And there at the back, behind the linga or near the linga, they saw a young boy sitting. So they were very much awestruck to see him sitting in those conditions, seemingly unmindful of anything. So they tried to talk to him, but he wasn't aware of their presence. So eventually they decided it's not safe for him to remain there. It's not a hygienic place to stay. So they wanted to bring him out. So they lifted his body. Since he had been sitting in the same place for several weeks, and since the floor was dirty and there were insects there, ants and other insects had eaten his thighs. So his legs were, and blood had come and then pus had come. So he was stuck to the ground, as it were. So when they lifted him, those wounds on his thighs opened, and then they realized how completely oblivious he was to the body. So they brought him out and they took him to another part of the temple, and they slowly started to feed him and to take care of him. And he was so unmindful of the body. When he had come there, he had removed all his clothes and he was wearing only a kopin, that's a loincloth. But that loincloth also had become dilapidated. So for some weeks he was sitting there naked, completely unmindful of the body. But then there's an annual festival there called Deepam. Since that festival was coming, some devotees came and said, Swami, if people are going to be coming from all over, from many different districts, they'll be coming here and there'll be a lot of police presence. So it won't be appropriate for you to sit in naked. So they lifted him up and they tied a kopin on him. So after a few years, he slowly returned to what in our view is a normal life and started talking to people and everything. And slowly followers gathered around him. And eventually an ashram grew up around him. But what is most remarkable about him, I mean, apart from his outward life, is the teachings that he gave. Because the teachings he gave are essentially the same as the ancient philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, which is one of the many philosophies in India. It's the philosophy of non-dualism. And that is the philosophy that ultimately there is one only without a second. But though he taught this ancient teaching, he taught it in a very fresh and in a very fresh and simple way. That is, in the past, because in India there were so many different competing systems of philosophy, the philosophies tend to become more and more complex, and they have to answer more and more arguments against them, and so on. So it has become unnecessarily complicated. He re-expressed the essence of Advaita in an extremely simple and in a very original manner to give a fresh clarity to it. I will now talk about his teaching. One of the first disciples who came to him was a devotee called Shiva Pillai. And he came to him when he was about 20, 21, about 1900, 1901, 1902, around that time. And when he had been at university, he had studied philosophy. That means Indian philosophy. But so he had some questions based on what he had studied. But I mean, he wasn't interested just in academic answers. He wanted real answers. And what struck him as the one most important question of all philosophy is, who am I? So the first question he asked is, Swami, who am I? And since Bhagavan wasn't talking much in those days, sometimes he would reply by speech, but often he would just reply writing on the sand. So then Shiva Pillai started to bring a slate and chalk and some pieces of paper. And so sometimes he wrote on a slate or on pieces of paper. So he gathered all these answers. And many years later, after more than 20 years, he published these. And when they were published, they became so popular that Bhagavan himself decided to rewrite them in the form of an essay. That essay is a work called Nana, that means who am I? When he wrote it as an essay, he added at the beginning an introductory paragraph, which is not in the original. And that introductory paragraph is really summarizes the whole of his teachings. So I will first read through it, but then I'll explain it clause by clause. What he says in the first paragraph, obviously he wrote this in Tamil, but this is the English translation. Right? Since all jivas, that's all sentient beings, like to be happy always, without what is called misery, since for everyone the greatest love is only for oneself, and since happiness alone is the cause of love, in order to obtain that happiness, which is one's own nature, which one experiences daily in dreamless sleep, which is devoid of mind, oneself knowing oneself is necessary. For that, self-investigation, called who am I, alone is the principal means. In the first sentence, he's giving an argument to establish the fact that our happiness is our own real nature. But first, he gives a number of reasons for this. The first one is, since all sentient beings want to be or like to be always happy without what is called misery, that is, whatever else we may desire, we desire it because we think it makes us happy. Some people say happiness isn't the only goal of human existence. People want to have fulfillment in so many ways, but ultimately, whatever we want it because we believe it's going to make us happy. whether it's material things or spiritual things or whatever it is, from the smallest ant to the highest God in heaven, everyone is seeking happiness. As Bhagavan said, the reason we're seeking happiness is because happiness is our real nature. But I'm jumping the gun. So he said, since all sentient beings want to be always happy without misery, then the second reason he gives is, since for everyone, the greatest love is only for oneself. That is, whatever else we may love, we love ourselves more than we love any other thing. We love other things because the things that contribute to our happiness, we love those things. The things that seem to detract from our happiness, we dislike them. So ultimately, we love ourselves more than we love any other thing. So that's the second premise. The third premise is, since happiness alone is the cause of love, what he means by this is, we love those things but we believe are going to make us happy. So the fact that we love ourselves more than we love any other thing, and the fact that we always want to be happy, these indicate that happiness is what we actually are. Happiness is our real nature. So then he goes on to I mean, that is the inference of these first three clauses, but he then gives another argument. He says, in order to obtain that happiness, which is one's own nature, why? So he's already given one set of reasons why it's one's own nature. He then gives another reason, which one experiences daily in dreamless sleep, which is devoid of mind. That is, sleep is a state in which we are perfectly happy without any misery. Though we are separated from the mind and from all other from all phenomena. As he says, it's devoid of mind. There's no mind there, no phenomena. We're not aware of anything other than ourselves. But in that state, we're perfectly happy. No one ever has any complaints about dreamless sleep. No one ever said that they're miserable in sleep. We all know sleep is a peaceful and calm state where we're perfectly happy. So since we are separated from everything else in sleep, the fact that we remain happy is another reason, another indication that happiness is our real nature. So he says, in order to obtain that happiness, which is one's own nature, which one experiences daily in dreamless sleep, dreamless is not there, but that's implied, which is devoid of mind, oneself knowing oneself is necessary. That is, in order to be happy, we need to know what we actually are, because happiness is our real nature. For that, Jnana-vichara literally means awareness investigation. It implies self-investigation, called Who Am I? Alone is the principal means. That is, in order to know what we actually are, we need to investigate ourselves to find out what we actually are. So this is the fundamental, this is the basis of his teachings. These are fundamental principles of his teaching. This is something no one can argue with. We're all seeking happiness. Everyone wants to be happy. But though we all want to be happy, and though we seek happiness in so many different ways, none of us are ever fully satisfied. We may seem to be satisfied briefly, but very quickly dissatisfaction gives way to dissatisfaction. Whatever we desire, we are dissatisfied so long as we don't obtain it. When we obtain it, very briefly we may seem to be satisfied, but it doesn't give us the happiness free of misery, but we're all seeking. So again, we become dissatisfied. We can see this in all human desires. Whatever we seek, even when we attain things that we desire, Bhagavan says in one place, things that the nature of desire is such, but something that we want appears like Mount Meru, appears like a huge mountain before we obtain it. When we obtain it, it becomes as trivial as an atom. Then we want something else. So desire can never be satisfied. So why don't we find the happiness that we are all seeking? Because we are seeking happiness outside ourselves. We think that if I have more money, or if I have a better house, or if I didn't have these problems in my family or at work, or We think the external things are the cause of our happiness and the cause of our unhappiness. So we're always trying to improve our circumstances in one way or another, thinking that we'll get happiness thereby. But we live our life for so many years, and eventually this body passes, we leave this body. So, but none of us find this the infinite satisfaction, the infinite happiness that we're all seeking. But Bhagavan says the reason we don't find it is because we're looking for it in the wrong place. There's no happiness in anything external to ourselves. Happiness is our real nature. When the reason other things seem to give us happiness, if we desire something, so long as we are desiring that, that desire creates a dissatisfaction, an agitation in our mind. When we obtain whatever it is we desire, briefly that agitation, that dissatisfaction is quietened, so to speak. And so briefly, the mind is calmed down, and then we feel the happiness that is already within us. But then that quickly passes because dissatisfaction again arises, and again we go on seeking the happiness outside. So Bhagavan says, if we want to experience eternal and infinite happiness, we need to know what we ourselves actually are. So do we know what we actually are? If superficially we all think, oh yes, I know who I am. I know perfectly well I'm so-and-so. But when we think about it a bit more deeply, each one of us, we each currently aware of ourselves as a person. And the person we seem to be is composed of 5 components or layers, so to speak, which in Sanskrit are called the Panchakosha, the 5 sheaves. That is the physical body, the life that animates the physical body, and the mind, intellect, and will that function within it. We experience all, though these 5 components are more or less distinct from each other, we experience them collectively as ourself. As I, we experience the whole bundle of body, life, mind, intellect, and will. We experience the whole bundle as I. But though the bundle consists of parts, we know we are one and not many, and we are partless. I is indivisible. What we actually are is indivisible. So we who are one now experience ourselves as this, we who are one and partless now experience ourselves as this bundle of 5 components, which obviously are not one, they're distinct things. They're always associated with each other. So are we in fact all of these 5 components or any of them? And if we are not, what actually are we? We can, and merely analyzing these questions isn't going to, we're not going to find that happiness we're seeking, but analyzing the questions and analyzing this, what we are is necessary in order for us to firstly to understand what we are not, and then by elimination to at least understand conceptually what we actually are. So whatever we actually are must be something in the absence of which we would not exist. That is, if we can exist in the absence of something, that thing cannot be what we actually are. Likewise, if anything that we can, anything in the absence of which we can be aware of ourselves, if for example, if I take this body to be I, but if I'm ever aware of myself without being aware of this body cannot be what I actually am. It must be something other than myself. So using this logical principle, that we cannot be anything in the absence of which we exist, or or without being aware of which we would not be aware of ourselves, using this logical principle. If we ever exist and are aware of ourselves without being aware of any particular thing, that particular thing cannot be what we actually are. So applying this, we can determine whether any of these five components, the five sheaves, that constitute whatever person we now seem to be, whether this is what we actually are. While dreaming, we're aware of ourselves without being aware of the body and life that we now experience as ourselves. That is it. In dream, we are aware of ourselves as a body, but the body we experience as ourselves in a dream is not this body. So in dream, we are aware of ourselves without being aware of this body that we now, in waking state, experience as ourselves. Likewise, we're now aware of ourselves without being aware of ourselves as the body which we mistook ourselves to be in a dream. So we cannot be that dream body, and likewise we cannot be this waking body, because we in each state we exist without the body of the other state. However, in both waking and dream, we seem to be more or less the same mind, intellect, and will. So are these three more subtle components, are these what we actually are? No, they cannot be, because we exist and are aware of our existence in dreamless sleep without being aware of any of these components. That is, though we are not aware of any phenomena in dreamless sleep, we are now aware of having been in such a state. So the fact that we are aware that we were in a state where we were not aware of any phenomena means we couldn't be aware of having been in that state if we were not aware while we were in that state. That is, generally, we mistake sleep to be a state where we're not, that is, of non-awareness, not unconsciousness, but it's not actually a state of unconsciousness. It's a state in which we are not aware of anything other than ourselves. But the fundamental awareness I am, that remains and is clearly experienced by us in sleep. That's why, after waking up from sleep, we were clearly aware, yes, I was asleep. I was in a state in which I wasn't aware of anything else. So we were aware, though we weren't aware of anything else in sleep, we were aware of our existence. So that fundamental awareness of our own existence, I am, is what we actually are, because we're aware of our existence as I am now in the waking state, in dream, and in sleep. It's the one thing that remains unbroken throughout all these three states. The only thing that exists in all these three states, that exists and that we experience in all these three states, is this fundamental awareness of our own existence, which is what we experience as I am. So Bhagavan said, what we actually are is only this fundamental awareness I am. That's not awareness of anything else, but just a mere awareness of our own existence. And when we say awareness of our own existence, obviously, when we're aware of other things, those other things are objects and we are the subject. But being aware of our own existence isn't a subject-object relationship, because the awareness that is aware of our existence is not other than our existence. That is, our existence and our awareness are essentially one and the same thing. So it's not one thing being aware of another, it is just a state of self-awareness. In self-awareness, there's not one self that is aware and another self that it's aware of. It's only one self. We're aware only of ourselves. So it's not an awareness. It's not a transient awareness. It's not a transitive awareness. By transitive awareness, I mean awareness of something. It's intransitive awareness. It's just pure awareness but isn't aware of anything else. So that is what we experience in sleep, and that is what we experience even now, but with the addition of other things. So the difference between what we experience in sleep and what we experience in waking or dream, in sleep we are aware only of that fundamental awareness I am, whereas in waking and dream, we seem to be aware of so many other things also. why this is important to understand this, though merely by understanding this, we don't solve our problems. We don't suddenly become happy as soon as we understand. I mean, we don't suddenly lose all dissatisfaction and attain perfect satisfaction merely by understanding this, because it's only with our mind or intellect that we're understanding this conceptually. But if once we understand this, we can then know what it is we need to investigate. Because if happiness is our real nature, in order to experience happiness, we need to investigate ourselves to find out who am I, to find out what we actually are. But if we mistake ourselves to be the body or the mind or anything else, when we investigate ourselves, we'll be investigating the body or the mind or whatever else we take to be I. So we first need to clearly understand what we are not, so that we can then investigate what we are. When Bhagavan talks about self-investigation, what he means by self-investigation is investigating that our fundamental awareness of our own existence, because that is what we actually are. So in other words, sometimes people express it as awareness, investigating awareness. In other words, awareness means ourself, what we actually are. We are investigating ourselves. We're not investigating any phenomena, anything that appears and disappears is not ourself. We are investigating that which is ever existing and ever shining. That is our fundamental awareness, I am. So this is what Bhagavan means by self-investigation. So now we've understood this intellectually, but nevertheless, though we understand, but we are not this person consisting of body, life, mind, intellect, and will, we still experience ourselves as such. So in order to experience ourselves as we actually are, we need to investigate ourselves. As Bhagavan said, the means by which we can experience ourselves as we actually are is this simple practice of self-investigation. He also described this practice as self-surrender, because in order to know what we actually are, we need to give up the false self that we now seem to be. That is, so long as we take ourselves to be a person, this person seems to be ourself. This is a false, this is not our real self, it's what we seem to be. So we need to give up what we seem to be in order to experience ourselves as we actually are. So self-investigation and self-surrender are ultimately one and the same thing. However, he sometimes seemed to talk of them as if they were two different practices. That is because some people are more drawn to understanding this practice in terms of self-investigation, whereas other people who are more comfortable with the path of devotion, they can relate more easily to understanding this path in terms of self-surrender. But however we understand it, ultimately it's one and the same thing. So how can we find out what we actually are? When we, Bhagavan analyzed things a little more deeply. He said, though we now experience ourselves to be a person, what is it that experiences itself as I am this person? It is not the pure awareness that we actually are, because pure awareness is never aware of anything other than itself. So pure awareness never mistakes itself to be a person. The person we mistake ourselves to be, that is body, life, mind, intellect, and will, none of these things have any awareness of their own. They're what in Sanskrit, there's the word jada. Jada means non-aware and insentient. So all these things are insentient. That is, people think it's strange. How can you say the mind is insentient? What is meant by this is mind, if we analyze it, consists of two components, so to speak. There's the subject and the object. That is, most of the thoughts that appear in our mind are objects experienced by us. But there is an I that experiences these objects. So the I that experiences all the thoughts, that is what Bhagavan refers to as ego, and what he sometimes called the thought called I. And he says that is the first of all thoughts. And it's the only thought that is aware. That is, ego is aware of all other thoughts, but no other thought is aware either of itself or of ego. So ego is the one thought that is aware of all other thoughts. So ego is neither the pure awareness, nor is it the person that it mistakes itself to be. It is what is sometimes described as chit, jada, granti. Chit means awareness, jada means what is not aware, granti means not. That is, now, as ego, we are always aware of ourselves as I am this body. This body means all these five components. I am this person, these five sheaves. That is, as ego, we always experience ourselves as that. But though this ego experiences itself as I am this person, it is actually neither the pure awareness I am, nor is it this person. It is that's why it's described as a knot. When these two things become seemingly entangled, the knot that is formed by the entanglement of these two things, that is what ego is. So as ego, we are neither this person, nor are we the pure awareness. So ego is a false awareness of ourselves. So then he analyzes the nature of ego more. As he says in one verse in Uludunaptu, the nature of ego is a formless phantom ego, he describes it. It's formless because it's got no form of its own. It's a phantom because it's got no substance of its own. Because it is not its substance is the awareness, which it borrows from pure awareness. Its form is the person that it seems to be, the body. But it's not either of these. So it hasn't got any form of its own. It hasn't got any substance of its own. It borrows both its form and its substance from other things. And he says in that verse, he says, grasping form, it comes into existence. What he means by grasping form, it's only when we grasp the form of a body and take it, I am this form, I am this body, but we rise as ego. Grasping form, it comes into existence. Grasping form, it stands. Grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes. That is, having first grasped this body as I, we then, through our five senses, we're constantly grasping other forms. Here, grasping, what is meant by grasping, the term grasping is used in a metaphorical sense, because since ego is a formless phantom, it doesn't actually, it's got no hands to grasp things. We grasp things by being aware of them. So and then he says in that same verse, Tedinal autem pidicum. That means if sought, it takes flight. That is what he is revealing in that verse. That is verse 25 of a work called Ulunaptu, is that the nature of ego is such that it comes into existence, stands and flourishes, grasping form. That means grasping things other than itself. But if it instead of grasping other things, if it tries to grasp itself, it subsides and disappears. That is the nature of ego. Ego stands by being aware of things other than itself. That is, we as ego, we are always aware. We're aware. Firstly, we're aware of ourselves as a phenomenon, as a body, and we're consequently aware of other phenomena. So our awareness of objects, of phenomena, of multiplicity, arises with ego and it subsides with ego. In sleep, there's no ego, therefore there's no awareness of phenomena. As soon as we rise in waking or dream, we are aware of ourselves as a body and we're consequently aware of phenomena. So since the nature of ego is to be constantly aware of things other than itself, if ego tries to be aware of itself, it subsides and disappears because ego doesn't have any substantive existence. It's a mere phantom that seems to exist so long as it's looking at other things. When it looks back at itself, it doesn't find anything there. Or rather, it no longer seems to be ego. If we look at ourselves keenly enough, Bhagavan says, we will experience ourselves as pure awareness. That is an analogy which we can use to understand this. It's like saying, if in dim light, we mistake a rope to be a snake. How can we get rid of that snake? The snake is nothing but an illusion. There's actually no snake there at all. But so long as we see it as that rope as a snake, the snake seems to exist. So how to get rid of that snake? The only way to permanently eradicate that snake, we can take a stick and beat it, but we're not going to kill the snake in that way. The only way to eradicate that snake completely is to look at it very closely. Because if we look at it very very carefully, we'll see, oh, it's just a rope. And then the fear of the snake will at once vanish. So the seeming snake will cease to exist only when we see what it actually is. Likewise with ourselves, only when we investigate ourselves very keenly, when we look at ourselves very keenly, will we see that this ego is just an illusory appearance. There's no such thing as ego. What we actually are is just pure awareness. So in order to eradicate ego, we need to look at ourselves, that attend to ourselves very keenly. So that is the practice of self-investigation. What about the practice of self-surrender? It's the same ultimately, because since the nature of ego is to rise, stand, and thrive by attending to other things, and to subside and disappear by attending to itself, the only way we can surrender this ego is by investigating ourselves. However, in the path of devotion begins with devotion to God. And in the initial stages of the path of devotion, we conceive God as something other than ourselves. We are a small creature. God is that great whole who's created all this, or whatever. I mean, theists have so many different beliefs about God, but essentially they take God to be something far greater than themselves, something the greatest, that than which there's nothing greater. So that's obviously something other than this small person that we now seem to be. So on the path of devotion, we begin by taking God to be something other than ourselves. So in the early stages, most religious people, what do they pray to God for? They pray for health, wealth, well-being for their family or other things. In other words, they're praying to God for the things that they want God to give them. So their devotion then is not devotion to God himself, but devotion to the things that they think God can give them. So that's not, though that's a beginning, that's not the real devotion. The real devotion begins when we no longer want anything from God. We want God alone. So how can we attain God? Obviously, what stands between us and God is this little ego, this little person, this little self that we take ourselves to be. So in order for us to attain God, to become one with God, we need to surrender this ego. So how to surrender the ego? We first see what is the most obvious thing that stands between us and God is our own little will. We are not satisfied with God's will. I want this. So when the real path of devotion starts, we see the obstacle is our will. So we want to surrender our will to God. So your will is my will. Thy will be done. So we on the path of devotion, we begin trying to surrender our will to God. That means we have to be free from all desires, all likes, dislikes, attachments, fears, and so on. But so long as we rise and stand as ego, because the very nature of ego is grasping, because grasping form, it comes into existence, grasping form, it stands, grasping form, it flourishes. So since grasping is the very nature of ego, we cannot be completely free of desire and attachment and likes and dislikes so long as we rise as ego. So the root of all likes and dislikes and desires and attachments and fears and so on is our existence as ego. So if we want to surrender our will completely to God, we have to surrender ourselves completely to God. So slowly, though the path of surrender begins with surrendering our will to God, ultimately the surrender can be complete only when we give ourselves to God. And in order to give ourselves to God, we need to stop rising as ego. And to stop rising as ego, we need to investigate ourselves. So the path of surrender, ultimately, the path of devotion leads to surrender, and surrender leads to self-investigation. So often I say, but the pinnacle of all spiritual practices is the path of devotion, the path of bhakti, the path of love. The pinnacle of the path of bhakti is surrender. And the pinnacle of the path of surrender is self-investigation. So ultimately, we have to know what we actually are in order to get rid of this ego and thereby experience ourselves as the infinite happiness that we actually are. That, in a nutshell, is the teachings of Bhagavan Ramana. So if any of you would like to ask any questions about this, please do so.
That was great talk. Thank you very much, Michael. My question is, of all the techniques and practices that Sri Manama Maharshi gave, is there one very practical exercise you could give us this afternoon?
Essentially, he didn't give many practices.
Yeah.
He gave one practice, which is this practice of self-investigation. Self-investigation means that is the nature of our mind is to be constantly going outward. We're constantly attending to things other than ourselves. Though we are always aware of our own existence, we are more interested in other things than we are in ourselves, because we think that our happiness depends on these other things. So our attention is constantly going out. The out means away from ourselves towards other things. So the practice he taught us, withdrawing our attention from other things by trying to focus it on ourselves. That's on the mere awareness I am. This is an extremely simple practice, but it's also a very subtle practice. Often when people start, they struggle a little to understand this practice because we are so accustomed to attending to objects, to attending to phenomena, things other than ourselves. When we're asked to attend not to any object, but to a subject, we still look, there's still a subtle tendency to look for an object. But obviously, we can never be an object. We can never know ourselves as an object. We are always aware of ourselves. So, but though we are always aware of ourselves, so long as we are attending to other things, we neglect our self-awareness. So we are aware of ourselves, but we are negligently self-aware. The self-awareness is always there in the background, but we neglect it because we're interested in other things. So we have to cultivate an interest in just being aware of this fundamental self-awareness I am. So instead of being negligently self-aware, we need to be attentively self-aware. So it's a very simple practice, but at the same time, a very subtle practice. At first, when we started, we struggle a little, but it's like anything. If you're learning to ride a bicycle, or if you're a small child learning to walk, we start by, as a small child, when learning to walk, we get up and we walk a few steps and we fall down and we totter and we fall, and slowly we get the hang of it, how to balance on two legs. And later when we begin to cycle, we have the same problem, how to balance on two wheels. We have to fall off many times before we learn how to balance. So this practice is similar to that. We have to, just like the only way to learn to ride a bicycle, you can read all the books on the theory of center of gravity and everything, but the only way to learn to ride a bicycle is to get on a bicycle and start bicycling. Likewise, the only way to learn how to be self-attentive is to start trying to be self-attentive. And slowly we get the hang of it.
Okay. Thank you.
And this is a very simple practice. It's it's possible. I mean, it maybe is useful sometimes to sit with eyes closed and try to turn our attention within towards ourselves. But it's not necessary to be sitting with our eyes closed, even while walking, even while doing other things. We can be doing this because there is never a moment when we're not aware of ourselves. But that self-awareness, Bhagavan sometimes compared it to the cinema screen. Right? Cinema screen is always there, but when we go to the cinema to watch a film, though we're looking at the screen all the time, it's as if we never see the screen because we're not interested in the screen. We're only interested in the pictures. But when we're seeing the pictures, what we're actually seeing is the screen with pictures projected on it. So likewise, that screen of self-awareness, that is the background to all our experience. Whatever we experience, who experiences? I do. So that fundamental awareness I am, there the background of all that we experience. So it's a matter of shifting our attention away from the objects of experience back to the experiencer, away from what is perceived back to the perceiver. Is that clear?
Yeah, great. That's a great response. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So I'm sitting here listening to you and seeing you, and as I do so, I'm aware. But as I'm aware of something else. I'm aware of you. So there's me listening, and then there's you speaking.
Yes.
Is that an ego statement?
Yes, it is, because when you say you're aware of, you are sitting there, you say, what is sitting? It's the body is sitting. You say, I am seeing. What is it that is seeing? It is through the eyes of the mind is seeing. So the identification with the body and mind is there at the basis of all our experience of things other than ourselves. So long as we are aware of ourselves as body and mind, that which is aware of itself as body and mind is ego. So long as we're aware of any phenomena, anything other than ourselves, we are aware of ourselves as ego. We can understand this from dream. When we dream, we always experience ourselves as a person within a dream, within our dream. That is why when we dream, though the dream is entirely our own creation, it's a figment of our own imagination, but in dream, we don't seem to have control over it. If a monster comes chasing us, we can't just will the monster away. Why? Because we don't experience ourselves as the creator of dream. We experience ourselves as a creature within our dream. So all our experience of phenomena is based upon our experience of ourselves as I am this person. Now we experience ourselves as this body. In dream, we experience ourselves as some other body. But any state in which we experience phenomena, we are always aware of ourselves as I am this body. May not be the same body, but it's always the current body we always experience as ourselves.
If I want to move away from that as an ego statement, could I say we are one? We are one.
In a sense, yes, but so long as we implies two, you and me. To say that two is one is in essence.
I'm not very good at maths.
Yeah, right. But for example, if you've got a gold ring and a gold necklace, in substance they are one, but the forms are different. So in substance, we are one awareness. But so long as we identify ourselves with a form, so long as I'm aware of myself as Michael, I am not Elizabeth. So that difference arises when we limit ourselves as a form. When we are, the gold is gold, whether it's in the shape of a necklace or a ring or a crown or whatever it may be, a bangle or whatever, it's all gold. The substance is one, but the forms are different. That is why we need to distinguish ourselves from the form that we seem to be. The form that we seem to be is this body, life, mind, intellect, will. These are all form.
Thank you, Michael. That was really excellent. There's a question here about process, if that's right. The idea here is those 5 kosha are, as it were, more and more subtle, and there's a process of, I'm not the body, I'm not the life force, I'm not the mind, I'm the intellect, and but at the same time, there's also a feeling here that the realization of I am the awareness is almost a bit more Zen-like, of in an instant it is known. I just wondered if you could say anything about process.
Right. But process, first we need to, there needs to be a process of self-analysis. We need to analyze what we actually are. Now we mistake ourselves to be this body, life, mind, intellect, and will. So we need to first, by conceptual analysis, we need to understand why we cannot be any of these things. So that process, it obviously takes, we need to think about it and understand clearly. To see what we actually are, we then need to turn our attention back to what we actually are, not any of these 5 sheaves, but to the awareness. We can see what we actually are in an instant. It can only, ultimately, it can only happen in an instant. If you're looking at the snake, so long as you see it as a snake, you're not seeing it as a rope. When you recognize that it's a rope, the recognition that, oh, it's just a rope, that happens in an instant. One moment you're seeing it as a snake, next moment you're seeing it as a rope. You can't see it as a rope and as a snake simultaneously. You can, once you've seen it as a snake, you can understand, oh, this is the end I took to be the head, and this is what I took to be the tail, and you can understand that. But once you've seen that it's a rope, you can never mistake it to be a snake again. So ultimately, the ultimate realization of what we actually are happens in an instant. Why don't we see what we actually are here and now? We could, if we wanted nothing else. The problem is, we still have desires and attachments for things other than ourselves. And so long as we have desire and attachment for anything other than ourselves, we are not yet willing to let go of all these things. And so long as we are not willing to let go of these things, we remain as ego. Only when we are willing to turn, it is, so to speak, if you talk about the process, now our attention is facing outwards. We need to turn it, so to speak, 180 degrees, away from all phenomena, back towards ourselves. Because of the strength of our desires and attachments, we are not willing to turn it more than, maybe at first we start off 10 degrees, 20 degrees. As we go deeper in the practice, we may be turning 90 degrees, 150 degrees. We may be turning closer and closer to just being aware of ourselves. But because we still have lingering desire and attachment, we don't entirely let go of other things. Only when we are willing to let go of other things, in other words, when we're willing to surrender ourselves completely, will we be able to turn the full 180 degrees. When we turn, so if you turn 179 degrees, obviously this isn't literal, this is just a way of explaining. If you turn 179 degrees, that means you still have a lingering awareness of other things, of phenomena. When you turn the full 180 degrees, you've turned your back on all other things. So you're aware only of yourself. So only when you turn 150 degrees, 180 degrees, do you experience yourself as pure awareness. Until then, there's still some contamination of that pure awareness. It's not pure awareness, but it's still ego awareness. Does that adequately answer your question?
Really helpful, thank you.
Okay.
John Bates.
Thank you. A quick question, really. Attachment. Yeah. I'm struggling with that a little in terms of and I'm not being disrespectful here, but I'm not going to be going to some mountain and just in isolation and etc. I have a family, I have a wife, and I have attachment in that sense. And so how do I differentiate, or how do I deal with that attachment?
Right. Well, ultimately, attachment is inward, which is why, though Bhagavan was not opposed to people to outward renunciation, he said, if that is your destiny, just like marriage comes according to destiny, so also the outward renunciation comes according to destiny. So some people, it's their destiny to be married and to have a wife, children, grandchildren, and so on. Some people are destined to be monks or nuns or to live in a cave in the Himalayas or whatever. That is all outward, but that is not the real renunciation. What we need to, you can be sitting in a cave in the Himalayas and still having desire and attachment in your heart. So that is not renunciation. Renunciation means it has to be inward. So in the midst of our, we can do the spiritual practice in the midst of ordinary day-to-day life. It's not necessary to change our outward life. We can be pursuing this practice even in the midst of our life. Yes, we all have we all have desire and attachment. If we didn't have desire and attachment, the story would be over, everything would be finished. So we're now on a journey. We need not leave our family or anything. We can continue living the same life, but inwardly we need to slowly try to detach our mind. We need to learn to cultivate an inward detachment, because ultimately, if we use some discrimination, we all know one day, however dear our family are to us, however dear our husband or wife, our parents, our children, our grandchildren, however dear they may be, we know one day we're going to have to leave them all. When this body dies, we leave them all. So knowing that we're going to, but these things, I don't mean to undervalue. I mean, human relationships, love between people, is a very beautiful thing. And it's something that through this, through the human relationships, we learn to give ourselves to others. So in a way, the human relationships are a training for this spiritual path where we are trying to give ourselves, the ultimate giving of ourselves is to give ourselves completely to God. And when we give ourselves to God, since God is the whole, we are actually giving ourselves to all those who are dear to us. So ultimately, when we free our mind from all attachment, all those who are now dear to us, we will see as ourselves. We will not be losing them. We'll be becoming one with them. Because we are the one, what we ultimately are is the one infinite whole that encompasses everything.
Thank you.
Is that a helpful answer?
Very helpful. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes.
Kind of comment, really. It seemed like we were moving. I mean, it was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Moving from separation into unity and oneness.
Yes.
And that anything that separates us from that is the thing that we need to become unattached to.
Yes.
And then, oneness is where you see everything as you, really.
Yes.
If you like.
Yes.
I am
Yes.
everything. I'm all.
Yes.
And so it's moving away from that separation into that unity.
Yeah. Bhagavan exemplified this perfectly in his life. He had equal love for all, not only human beings, but all creatures, because he didn't see anyone, he didn't love us as a person. He loved each one of us as himself, because he didn't see us as anything other than himself. There was an incident when he was young. One day he was walking on the hill, on Arunachal Hill, and he was walking on the north side of the hill, and he saw a very big tree, and he wanted, that tree reminded him of a story that's told in the local Purana, the local mythological stories. So he wanted to go near that tree. So when he was walking up through a dry stream bed, at one point he had to step out to get round some obstacle. And while doing so, he brushed his thigh against a bush. And in that bush, there happened to be a hornet's nest. So the hornets were disturbed. Obviously, it was unintentional. He wasn't even aware of the presence of a hornet nest there. But that leg, that thigh, brushed against the bush and thereby disturbed the hornets. So the hornets rushed out. So he stood there perfectly calmly and let the hornets sting his thigh. Because he thought, though not intentionally, this thigh has disturbed them. So let them let them be satisfied by stinging. The hornets didn't sting any other part of his body, only that thigh. And you know, hornets said they got a huge sting, and so his leg became very swollen. I mean, after they stung him to their satisfaction, they then went away. So he very, very slowly limped back to the cave in which he was then living on another part of the hill. And when devotees saw the swelling in his leg, they would have applied oil or whatever was to soothe it. And after a few days, when the swelling started to subside, they used pliers to one by one remove the sting. As they became visible, they were able to remove them. So he had so much love for those hornets. He didn't see those hornets as other than himself. So he could completely see their perspective. Someone had come and brushed against their nest and disturbed it. So it's their nature to sting whatever disturbs them. So such was his love. His love was equal to all creatures.
Thank you. Yes.
We with our mind, because we see separation, we can vaguely understand, but we cannot really understand what it is to see everything as one, to see nothing as other than oneself. But that is the goal towards which we are moving.
Mm.
And that is why, if we're following this spiritual path, the more we, even though we may not have surrendered ego completely, the deeper we go in the spiritual path, the more ego is attenuated, so to speak. So our identification with ourselves as I am this person, though it's still there, it's less strong. If a person has a very strong ego, they've got a very strong identification. I am this person. So I alone matter. It doesn't matter whether, if I want something, I'm going to get it by hook or by crook. It doesn't matter whether if others suffer as a consequence, what does it matter? All that matters is myself. That type of selfishness is there when ego is very strong. The more we follow this spiritual path, the more ego will subside, the more ego will become attenuated. So we will less strong. We will feel less that distinction between self and others. That is how compassion naturally grows in our heart. Compassion and empathy will naturally grow in our heart to the extent to which we follow this path and thereby surrender ego. And the ultimate in compassion and empathy is exemplified by that story I just said of how Bhagavan allowed those hornets to sting his leg. That's the ultimate in empathy and compassion. We have not reached there yet, but that
no, not right, not yet.
That is the direction in which we are trying to move,
Yeah.
Aspiring to move in that direction.
Thank you.
Actually, can I say something?
Yes, please.
The mountain behind Michael is sort of prompting a thought that as we're speaking, it's as if we're trying to make our way up to a higher level of consciousness, of better self-knowing, a more willing conformity with God, a pure devotion. If we could be in our consciousness at the peak of the mountain, then when we look at each other, we would see into each other the oneness. somehow we have to be taking the higher perspective in so that these things flow naturally, rather than seeing ourselves as sort of having to scrabble up the mountain. That's just how I see it at the moment, looking at the image behind you, Michael. Yes, it's the higher perspective that will rescue us.
Yes, and we gain that higher perspective by going deeper within. We go higher by going deeper.
Mm. And perhaps knowing the unitive principle. If the unitive principle is soul, for example, yes, then you've already got the thing that unites us.
Yes, yes, yes. But now we have limited ourselves, because I'm now aware of myself as I am Michael, I am this person, I am this and I'm not that. So I have separated myself from all other things. If I know myself as I actually am, I'm thereby casting off that limitation. And therefore, there's nothing experienced as other than ourself. Everything is experienced as one, as ourself alone. That is why the ultimate truth of Advaita is one only without a second. Ekameva Advaitam. That is, there is no other. That is the point towards which we are moving. But in order to experience that, we need to cast off this limitation. And to cast off this limitation, we need to be aware of ourselves as we actually are.
Thank you.
This is a back to basics question.
Right. The whole subject is about basics, so that's good.
Yes. Since the search is for formlessness, in a sense,
yes,
what purpose does form have? Hence evolution, really, and creation.
Well, let us first experience ourselves as formless and then ask the question. Ultimately, form is not real. Just like the snake, there's no snake there at all, there's only a rope. Okay, the rope is also a form, but that is just an analogy. The snake is an analogy, in that analogy, the rope represents what actually exists, which is formless. The snake represents the form, which is something superimposed upon what is formless. So when we know the formless, then let's see whether that question still requires answering then. Let us first realize what actually exists, and then we can begin to, if necessary, we can begin to ask questions about what seems to exist. Form obviously is an appearance. It doesn't actually exist because we exist in sleep without experiencing any form. So form is something that appears in waking and dream and disappears in sleep. So it is not something that is eternal or lasting. It's a fleeting appearance. So rather than asking the purpose of what is unreal, let us first know what is real.
Okay.
I think we will need to draw to a close fairly soon, but before I do, any last observations or questions?
Hello, just to say thank you to Michael. Michael.
Yes.
It was a lovely talk. I very much enjoyed your description of Bhagavan's life. I found it very vivid and well described, and it really brought the atmosphere of, his awakening, the circumstances of his awakening. The several analogies came to me in addition to your analogy of the snake and the rope. I also thought of the analogy when you were talking of the water and the wave, so that when one perceives oneself, we are always we're aware of ourselves as separate individuals, as waves. But when you sense that you are composed of water, just like the sea, then you see that all the other waves are also composed of water, while existing as waves at the same time. So I've always found that a helpful analogy And the other one is the lovely story that Bhagavan told about the pilgrims crossing the river. And when they got over to the other side, they decided they better count how many went over the river to check that everybody was alive and well. And they started counting, each started counting. And the unfortunate thing is that each one left themselves out of the count. So they came to the conclusion that somebody had been lost in the water and started to wail and moan. And it was only when the wisest guide of all got, you know the story, you can tell it much better than me, but...
well, a passerby came by and saw them all wailing.
Yeah, the passerby, yeah.
And so he asked, what is the trouble? They said, we were 10 of us and we crossed the river and now we can count only 9. So he quickly counted and saw there were 10 of them. So he then said, okay, rather than counting everyone else, each of you count yourself. I will tap you with a stick. When I tap you with the stick, you count. So he tapped the first one, 1, the second one, 1. When he tapped the last one, he said 10. And they said, oh, good, we found, they started thanking him for helping them to find the missing one. But of course, no one was ever missing. They were just overlooking to count themselves.
Yeah.
Likewise, Bhagavan said, all the problems in life are because we are overlooking ourselves. Instead of looking at ourselves, we are looking at others. And thus all problems arise. If we look back at ourselves, then we will see that all is one.
That's really nicely put. Thank you so much. Because once you know you exist, then even though you're engaged in daily life, you never forget that you truly exist. Your existence is the fundamental awareness. And then daily life then flows from while that fundamental awareness remains. So
yes.
So there isn't a sense of, even the sense of separation is provisional only.
Yes.
But underneath you feel the underlying sense of unity, which the other lady, one of our friends present, she expressed that very well too. So
yes, that's true. And the more clearly we understand this, the easier it is to integrate the practice into our life, because all the practice is just holding on to that remembrance of I am.
Yeah.
And that is always there. The problem is we are too much interested in other things, so we overlook this ever-present I am. So it's a matter of shifting our interest away from other things back towards what is fundamental, which is just this awareness I am.
And then there's this great sense of relief. I forgot. Of course, I'm there all the time.
Yes.
And I'm just thinking that my last question really, Michael, is in the present very, very difficult circumstances in the world with the pandemic and all the rest of it, and those of us who are practicing self-inquiry and endeavoring to live in this way, it appears on the surface to make not the slightest difference, because the overwhelming majority, unfortunately, the overwhelming majority of the world kind of doesn't have a clear awareness of this kind of profound teaching. So one feels that all our best endeavors are really making no difference to the world. But I feel myself, but the quiet, silent practice of doing one's best in this way does make a difference. And I'd like you to maybe tell everyone how the silent practice of Bhagavan's teaching does make a difference, even though on the surface everything and the chaos in the world goes on just as it always has done. Yeah.
If we are following this practice, even if we are not doing any good to the world, at least we are refraining from doing any harm. Because so many of the people who, with all good intention, are trying to do good in the world, often when we try to change the world, you solve one problem and some other problem is created. The world has always been a place of problems. So if we start setting our own house in order first, at least we are not causing trouble to the world.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I mean, none of this is mine. It's all what I learned from Bhagavan. So I am just I'm just a channel through which it's flowing. There's nothing nothing of my own.